Hello, welcome back to our live coverage of the UN climate talks here in Cancun in Mexico. Delighted to welcome Andrew Steer, who is the Special Envoy for Climate Change for the World Bank. And we're going to try and cover some of the very complicated issues around finance in a language which is accessible to people out there who aren't in this convention centre. But I guess the first question to ask is why is finance important in these climate change talks?
Well, because we need quite a lot of money to solve the problems. We've just done a major review of how much it will cost to help countries adapt, for example. We've looked around the whole world, and it's going to be around $100 billion extra a year. Now, that's money over and above what they will need to do their regular development. So they have to have schools and clinics and roads and everything. But in addition to that, they're going to have to do those things differently. They're going to have to make them more climate resilient. They're going to have to invest in different types of agricultural research in order to make crops more climate resilient. So there's $100 billion a year for you. That's quite a lot of money. And then, of course, there's the whole sort of move to a low carbon development trajectory. And that also will require a lot of money. So that's why we need the money. That's why money is so important. But I would make one point, and that is that actually the countries we work with, and we're now in over 130 countries helping them on climate change, they're actually not waiting for the deal. They need a global deal very badly, but they're not actually waiting for it. They're just getting on with the job because it is so important. And so it's actually quite exciting what's going on there. I mean, there are really two worlds. There's the world of negotiation, which is here, and that necessarily is tough, it's protracted, and sometimes it's not very glamorous actually. I mean, going through word by word. Then over here there's the world of action, and you've got innovation that is amazing, and it's not just in the high-tech countries, it's in low-income countries, it's in Africa. So this is actually quite an exciting time.
And what kinds of things is this money going to be spent on? You said it's going to kind of help people to adapt, help them survive. What role might the World Bank have in helping people, and what kind of things might the money be spent on?
Well, let me give you two examples. First, a small example. Today, poor farmers in Kenya are being supported to do their agriculture differently. So they might have very small plots of well under a hectare of land. They've never had very high yields. There are programs, there are different ways of doing intercropping, there are different seeds, there are different tillage methods, and as a result of climate finance, farmers are now getting cash subsidies to do things differently, and it is having what we call a triple win. It is increasing their yields, so they get more income. It is making their crops more resilient to climate change, which is happening every day now. And also, it is sequestering, that means pulling carbon out of the air into the soil. So that's a triple win, helps solve the problem of climate change, and it helps make them more resilient. Now, that's a very small example, very much a pilot, daring work. The other end of the spectrum, we are putting in $700 million into North Africa, concentrated solar, and we're bringing in private sector money, carbon finance money, and it's going to be a $7 billion project, and that will triple the entire installed capacity worldwide of concentrated solar energy. And what will happen as a result of that is that poor households in North Africa and the Middle East will for the first time get electricity, but in addition to that, they will sell some of the electricity to Europe. So for the first time, the electricity which has been flowing south from Europe through Spain, under the water to Morocco, will now start going the other way. And this is amazing. So you need small investments, you need huge investments. And both are necessary.
It sounds really exciting, and I think there is. Well, I certainly haven't spoken to anybody who thinks that huge amounts of money are not necessary. But there seems to be some controversy about the World Bank's involvement in this. Why do you think some people are critical of the World Bank as an institution distributing climate funds?
I can't possibly imagine, actually. I mean, why would you not want the largest international development, agency to engage in climate change? Now, some people, an old-fashioned view is, well, why would an agency that's worried about poverty reduction and economic growth and jobs, why would they worry about climate change? Well, the answer is climate change is threatening everything that we've been working on. So it's totally legitimate that a poverty agency would be here and engaged.
Well, I think some of the campaigners who we've been speaking to, they've said that they really feel that developing country interest needs to be at the absolute heart of any kind of adaptation financing. And they worry that those interests aren't really represented at the heart of the World Bank, and indeed some developing countries saying that you haven't really delivered in the past about your promises to reduce poverty. So do you think there's some kind of, is this just an ideological thing, or do you think there may be some kind of basis in fact here? Because there clearly are concerns, and I'm trying to get to the bottom. Why are they there?
Well, I think I do think there are genuine concerns. And I think it has something to do with the fact that, in the old days, we would go in to really help countries grow, and we would support infrastructure. And some people felt we didn't give enough attention to environmental safeguards or social safeguards. And this would have been 20, 30 years ago. We now have the highest environmental and social safeguards in the world, and to the extent there's a criticism from developing countries, it is that sometimes we seem to be asking too much. So we have to really try and disentangle the issue, because sometimes northern critics will say, oh, you need more safeguards. And by safeguards we mean make absolutely sure that all impacts, unintended impacts of, say, a road or what have you, would be looked at. And then others say, well, wait a minute, you're paying too much attention to that. So, what we try and do is get the right balance, but we are owned by 190 countries in the world. We are owned by the developing world. And
are they kind of equally represented?
Well, we have different institutions, but World Bank proper now, it's about 48% is developing country votes, and about 52% is industrial country votes. But when it comes to, say, climate change, we manage the Climate Investment Funds, which is a $6.3 billion program, and we implement them together with the regional development banks, and that is exactly 50-50. So it's actually quite inspiring, because you will have countries like China and India and Brazil and sitting there with the United States, with Europe, with Japan and so on, and they will be discussing Mexico's low-carbon development strategy, which we then finance, or what I just told you about there, North Africa. So and you'll be discussing it in a non-political, a technical, a professional way, bringing 50-50. So there's absolutely no reason whatsoever. I mean, we are owned by the countries of the world, and so they can choose to make it work however they want, and we are delighted to have the privilege of helping to manage these precious resources, this 6.3, which is the biggest sum of money for climate change in the developing world today, and we have designed the governance exactly along the lines that was discussed in Copenhagen a year ago.
And so moving away from the politics of it a little bit and down to the practicalities, you've talked about the need for climate aid to be kind of new and additional to existing funding for poverty relief around the world. Presumably that means you're going to have to distinguish between projects that are development projects, traditional development projects, and climate projects. How on earth are you going to do that?
Well, this is an excellent question. Our view, and I'm sure it's yours too, is that when it comes to spending the money, making the investments, those investments should be made by the countries themselves, and they shouldn't be saying, oh, this is development, this is adaptation. No, I mean, the development should be climate resilient. So in other words, it's the way you do things will be different. It's not that you do your development and then you do your adaptation, or you do your development and then you do your mitigation. It's integrated together. So whilst it may be appropriate to raise money differently, so it's entirely appropriate to say, okay, here is official development assistance and the budget of the developing country, and we're putting that in because we want to educate children and promote development, and then a separate set of money to say, but we've got to do it differently. We've got to do it in a climate resilient way and a way that moves to a low carbon economy. But once you've got the money, you actually then want to mix the two together, because they need to be implemented together if they're going to be effective.
Okay. And when it comes to getting the money, what do you think would be a good mix of sources? For the new climate fund that we have, that's been suggested here by the High Advisory Panel, where should we get this money from?
Well, as you know, there was Ban Ki-moon's high-level advisory group on finance, and that's come out with a report. And it was the exam question for it was, how are you going to get this 100 billion that we promised last year? And what this group came out with was they felt that they were not the ones to decide how much should be public money and how much should be private and how much should be carbon markets. But what they said was, look, you're going to have to raise a lot of public money, and there are good ways of raising it. And the smart ways to raise money are by linking it to carbon emissions itself. And what you want to do is have a carbon price that's about $25 a ton or more. You might want to tax currently untaxed oil and diesel use for international shipping and airlines. Currently no taxes on those, whilst you and I get into our cars and we put petrol in them, which is deeply taxed. So there's a sort of asymmetry there. No tax for international shipping, but a lot of tax for them. And so that would be another possibility. Auctioning the rights to emit. So they came up with a whole set of good ideas for raising money, and then they said, look, you're never going to have enough public money to do all you want. So the name of the game is going to be leverage. So what you want to do is use that money to shift the incentive structure in the private sector, for example, so that the investments they might have done in such and such, it'll now be more attractive for them to do this in a more sort of sustainable way. And that's the trick. And when I mentioned a moment ago about how we put in 700 million and that leverages 7 billion, that's the name of the game. We run this thing called the Clean Technology Fund, again with the regional banks. It's a $4 billion fund, and it will lead to clean investments of 40 billion. In other words, that's the leverage that the AGF, the Advisory Group on Finance, was recommending.
So how are you going to judge which of this money is new and additional? If you kind of invest 5 billion, say, and it results in 17 billion pounds worth of projects, how do you know which of that money wouldn't have been invested anyway?
Well, that's a difficult question. And as you know, there are lots of suggestions. And I think each country that puts money in has to really ask itself, are we going the extra mile? Are we making it new and additional? And this is difficult. From your accent, it sounds like you come from the United Kingdom, do you? Well, I mean, there's a very interesting case. The United Kingdom has pledged to move from about, 0.52% of GDP to 0.7% of GDP, and it's going to be doing that. And that's a wonderful commitment. Now, of that increase, some of that increase, but relatively small amount of that increase will be put into climate finance. Seems to me that, it's perfectly legitimate to say, well, we're going to be increasing our regular aid by quite a lot, and we're going to be allocating a small amount of that increase to climate finance. That sounds to me fair enough. Now, if you're another country where, maybe your overall aid program is not rising or it's falling, it's then if you were to code your climate finance as ODA, it's pretty hard to make the case that is new and additional.
And we began the conversation by saying that this money is going to be spent on helping poor countries adapt to the devastating impacts of climate change. And we've spoken a lot this week to different people about the fact that this is essentially the responsibility of rich countries to help these poor countries because it's our emissions. And so in light of that, how would you define adaptation, and why do you feel that we should be giving this money in the form of loans sometimes rather than just simply as grants?
Oh, I don't have an opinion whether it should be loans or grants. I mean, all of us would prefer grants. I mean, if I gave you a choice, would you like a grant or a loan for the same amount, you'd take grant, and so would I. But this is for countries to determine. That's what the negotiators have to figure out. This is not what the World Bank decides. It's for the negotiators to decide how much are they going to put in, and are those monies going to be grants or are they going to be loans? So in the case of our largest adaptation fund, which is called the PPCR, the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, a $1 billion fund, and more than half of it is grant, and the rest is zero interest rate loans, I believe. That's not our choice. It's the money that we were given, if you like. So,
so are these conciliatory loans without high interest rates? So are they considered to be foreign aid? Is that what they're kind of classified as?
That's for the countries to decide that give them. It's not for us to decide. So they have to. I mean, the way that the ODA, Official Development Assistance Reporting, works is that the country that gives it, submits to the OECD DAC, that's the Development Assistance Committee, what they've given, and then they would code it as they would claim it that it's aid or it isn't, and OECD DAC would say yes, it is, or no, it's not. So that's the way the system works.
Okay. Well, just before we wrap up, and thanks very much for talking to us, we've spoken to lots of different people this week with huge kind of variation of opinions, and we spoke to some indigenous people from the Amazon actually, and they were saying to us that they're really worried about the kind of commodification and the impact of markets in this whole business really, and equally we've been speaking to business people, and they've been saying, if we're going to get finance flowing in the right directions, you have to engage business. But does it worry you this kind of drive towards markets and an economic value on nature, and the fact that we have to have some kind of economic value on nature in order to protect it? Is that something that kind of sits comfortably with how you see the world, or is it essential? How do you feel about it?
Well, I mean, our view, my view, and my colleagues at the World Bank and the World Bank believes this. We've got to take a people-focused approach to everything. I mean, the reason we care so deeply about climate change is because it is going to undermine poverty reduction. So, yes, you absolutely need to put people central. That's your starting point. Sometimes, if you do that, it will help to use market-based instruments. So, for example, over the years, many people have said, understandably, you can't put a price on water. Water is a gift from God. I mean, for heaven's sake, you can't put a price on water. And yet, if you look, for example, at take Australia, where it's just gone through a huge drought, because it had the right institutions in place and had assigned, property rights, if you like, which some wouldn't like. Because of that, you were able to see, even in this drought, water managed more efficiently. So water that was going in to rice farming, which used a lot of water, is actually not going into so much rice farming. They've now farmers have had an incentive because water has a price to switch out of rice, and now there's a boom in almonds, for example, which is a huge value-adding crop. So in other words, don't assume that just because you put a price on something that somehow the human being is not in the center. But obviously, when it comes to dealing with forests, I mean, this is a highly sensitive issue, and that's why we spend so much time in our forest work, in dialogue with indigenous people, and in conversation about how we need to learn, and we all need to learn about how to do things. So I'm sympathetic to the tone of your question, but I think it's a big mistake to I don't believe in the commodification of everything. The very word doesn't sound right, but I do believe we have to value something. Yes, yeah.
In the economic sense.
Economic, spiritual. I mean, my own view as a Christian, actually. I mean, I believe that human behavior is driven more by issues of an inner core of values. I believe that the reason that at the end of the day, why are we trying to save the planet from climate change, it's not, in my view, because actually 60 years from now GDP would be, 6% lower. That's not why I'm in it. It's because we have this planet that God has given us and we ought to protect it, because our future children, grandchildren, and so on deserve to inherit. So in that regard, I don't believe in commodification. But when it comes to, for example, the red agenda, which is basically how forest dwellers, those who manage forests, can get compensation for keeping the forests living rather than chopping them down, I do believe that it's very valuable to have a market-based mechanism. Yes, because I think trees are genuinely more valuable alive than dead, and yet if you just leave it to the regular marketplace, you will get excessive deforestation. So a sort of economics for a while. I mean, way back in 1923, Professor Pigou at Cambridge University was the first who came up with this idea of externalities and how you can actually tax externalities. If I'm a factory and I'm polluting and you're downstream of me, I have an incentive to pollute until you have some right not to be polluted. And so if a government comes and says, I'm polluting, the government has every right to tax me for my pollution and give you the money. That's a market-based instrument that actually can work very well. Exactly the same kind of principle applies for when we think about a red agenda and including forests and carbon markets, for example. And I believe they can be very helpful as long as they are carefully regulated and as long as sort of human beings sort of stay at the center of things.
And can you account for kind of the spiritual and cultural value of forests and the like through kind of talk of externalities? Is that, I'm not familiar with it, so you have to like, how do you account for that? And I realised I've already taken more of your time than I said I would, so I'll leave that as my final question. But just kind of, there's the spiritual and cultural value of these things. Does it worry you that we have to place an economic value on forests to stop people chopping them down when we're talking about human values?
Well, I don't think you can easily put monetary values on spiritual values. No, I don't, and I wouldn't want to do that. But what we're talking in carbon markets is we're putting a monetary value on something that is very measurable. It is the carbon that's embedded in the soil. So all we're saying is, look, by chopping a tree down, you're actually causing what we'd call a negative externality for the world as a whole. And therefore, the world as a whole should compensate you for not doing it. I mean, it's fair. And that's what it is. So it's fairness. That particular issue is nothing to do with spiritual values. Now, it is very, very important, though, that we all bring our own values and we dig deep internally and ask, why are we doing certain things? Why is my lifestyle either helping or hurting? And I agree, you don't necessarily want to commodify that. So I think that the only point I would make is that market instruments can help in certain circumstances. They've been proven to help, and we shouldn't immediately reject them just because we regard the spiritual side of things as important.
Okay, thank you ever so much for talking to me, and again, apologies for keeping you longer than I said I would, but it was a really interesting discussion.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.